So yesterday I reviewed, I think, the 16 common cards from the upcoming mini-set, and today I believe I have 14 rares to review. And we'll start off with Proving Grounds for Demon Hunter. 6 mana, summon 2 minions from your deck, they fight. So we saw a very similar card in the past for Paladin, Duel. Summoned a minion from each player's deck and they fought, but this summons 2 from your deck. So, at a glance, it seems kind of bad, because, like, Demon Hunter does have good big minions, right? But if you summon 2 Illidari Inquisitors with this, they just both die, and then it was 6 mana to do nothing. Or if you get, like, 1 Inquisitor and 1 Ancient Voidhound, then you played a 6 mana 10-2, which also isn't great. But there are some ways around this effect. You can, of course, just play some big minions and some small minions and try to high roll. If you hit Ancient Voidhound and Crimson Sigil Runner, for instance, then that's a pretty solid turn 6. You can also use Death Rattles to sort of play around this a bit. If you hit like 2 copies of Fell Summoner, and then the Fell Summoner pulls out 2 Ancient Voidhounds or Illidari Inquisitors or whatever, then you're pretty happy about that. Coilfang Warlord is another good option for that. Getting into neutrals, you've got Scrapyard Colossus, Plagued Protodrake, so there are a lot of pretty good things you can do with Proving Grounds. Another way to abuse this, I think, is with Dormant minions. So if you pull out the Dormant minion, I think it automatically goes dormant, and then there's just nothing for your other minion to run into. So if you play this big imprisoned minion, it comes out, your Illidari Inquisitor just kind of gets to stay in play, and then you get this imprisoned minion that wakes up in a couple of turns, and that can be pretty strong as well. There are maybe a couple options for neutrals. You can play Neralex. I guess most of these go dormant off of a Battle Cry. But you do have a few options for dormant minions. So it seems like there probably are enough ways to abuse this effect that it's definitely a playable card. But like everything else, we have to consider, is it meta viable? Does it stand up to Quest Mage? Does it stand up to something like Garrote Rogue? I'm a little skeptical of that, but it's definitely a card worth experimenting with. Next up for Druid, we have the Rig Carpenter. 2 mana 2/1 pirate. With Battle Cry, draw a choose 1 spell and split it. So this is just a pretty solid card. 2 mana 2/1, draw a card, and it like sort of draws 2 cards. So the way this works, if it's not clear, is say you draw Nourish. Instead of drawing a Nourish, you'll draw a 6 mana that says gain 2 mana crystals and a 6 mana that says draw 3 cards. I know we've had this effect in the past, but I cannot remember what card it was that split the effects. So anyway, pretty powerful card. But the problem is it's only choose 1 spells, and there really just aren't that many of those. Nourish is pretty good. I think Runic Carvings is not really playable even with this card. You're not too excited to hit Feral Rage, and then you've got like Sow the Soil and Power of the Wild. If you're playing like a Celestial Alignment deck, like maybe you're pretty happy to hit the Nourish. But I can't really imagine that this card is strong enough, or like that interaction is strong enough to play this card with Nourish as your only real target. Maybe this makes more sense in an aggressive deck where you can play Sow the Soil and Power of the Wild. But then you're playing a 2 mana 2/1 in an aggro deck, and aggro Druid already has access to some pretty good card draw, so I'm not really too excited for this card, I would say. Next we have Moonlit Guidance, another Druid card. This one is 2 mana, discover a copy of a card in your deck. If you play it this turn, draw the original. So at a glance, I want to compare this to Shadow Visions, which was a very similar effect, and Shadow Visions is one of the strongest cards ever printed in the Priest class. But compared to Shadow Visions, sometimes this draws 2 instead of just the copy of the card from your deck. So it seems really, really good. One of the strong things about Shadow Visions, though, is that it was spells only, so you could target it more easily. The Moonlit Guidance is just any card in your deck, so it can hit minions, which may or may not be a good thing. But that is a difference for the card. But overall, though, I think this card just has to be really good. Druid decks do have a tendency to live or die by certain power cards. Most notably, at the moment, is going to be Overgrowth. So if you can just play 2 copies of Moonlit Guidance, which make you twice as likely to hit Overgrowth on turn 4, you're pretty happy about that. It doesn't really matter that you don't draw the original if you go like Guidance on 2 and then Overgrowth on 4. You're pretty happy to just consistently hit the Overgrowth on 4. And similarly, you can use this to find Celestial Alignment, use it to find Guardian Animals, just things that your deck is built around. This helps you find them more consistently. So it's a very good card. But you could even also play this in like an aggro druid. I don't necessarily know where you make the room for it. I don't know if the deck necessarily needs more card draw. But in theory, you could just play this to discover like an Arbor Up or a Greybough or Kazakus. Those kinds of powerful cards that have a lot of influence on the game. Or you could just play it on turn 4, discover a Squirrel, and play double Squirrel. Like, that's pretty good as well. Like I said, I don't know if you really, like, are you playing this over composting? Probably not. But it is a consideration, and I think any slower deck is playing this card for sure. This is just an extremely powerful Druid card. Moving on to Hunter, we have Doggie Biscuit. 2 mana, tradable. Give a minion +2/+3. After you trade this, give a friendly minion Rush. So the first thing I see with this card is Face Hunter. You play Intrepid Initiate on turn 1, slap a Doggie Biscuit on it on turn 2, and you have a 5/5 minion. Pretty good for turn 2. It's also just pretty good with Wolpertinger, which is a lot more likely to stick to the board. You just in general have a lot of token stuff, so this card seems pretty powerful. In Face Hunter in particular, I don't know how good being able to trade this really is. Like, trade is always nice to have access to, but I don't think this deck is really looking to spend 1 mana to draw a card. And I also don't really think Face Hunter cares that much about giving a random minion Rush. For one, you probably have a lot of tokens, and the Rush buff can just kind of miss. Like if you have a Wolpertinger in play, and then you go Cult Neophyte, trade Doggie Biscuit, 2/3 of the time you're going to hit one of the Wolpertingers, which can already attack. And even if you do hit the Cult Neophyte, do you care that much about trading as Hunter? Probably not. So in a deck like this, it's definitely powerful as a buff card, similar to, I think Mark of the Wild is +2/+3 now. Still unplayable, but this of course does have upside over that. And probably just makes more sense in the Hunter class than the Druid class. But another interaction for this card is with Barak Kodobane. So one of the downsides of Barak is sometimes you draw both of your quick shots, and then it doesn't draw a 2-mana spell. But if your 2-mana spell is Doggie Biscuit, then you can always just trade it back into your deck and always have something to draw off the Barak. I don't know if that's necessarily good in Face Hunter, but I could see that being an interaction that is relevant in some Hunter deck. And I think just in general, a slower Hunter deck might be more interested in this because it can use the tradable effect a little bit better. But I don't really think Quest Hunter would play it. Maybe something like a Guardian Animals deck could play this. Oh, I guess a pretty cool interaction with this and Guardian Animals is with Lake Thresher. Lake Thresher is really good off the Guardian Animals, but tends to kind of suck on its own. But this is another way you can give it Rush to abuse its cleaving effect, so that could be good. But yeah, it might be good enough just to play as a buff card in Face Hunter. I'm kind of leaning toward it not making the cut in Face Hunter, but like maybe you play one of instead of True Aim Crescent or something like that. Moving on to Mage, we have Arcane Overflow. 5 mana arcane spell that says deal 8 damage to an enemy minion. Summon a Remnant with stats equal to the excess damage. So my understanding of this is if you shoot something that has 5 health, you deal 5 damage to it, and then 3 excess damage, you make a 3/3. And this card seems reasonably strong. There was a Hunter card, Baited Arrow, that is pretty similar to this. It was deal 3 damage and then make a 5/5, which actually is the same break point. But Arcane Overflow is even better because you don't have to overkill, you can kill bigger things. So yeah, Arcane Overflow is pretty much just a better Baited Arrow. I think it's strictly better than Baited Arrow, isn't it? Unless I'm missing something. Well, I guess Baited Arrow could shoot your own minion if you wanted to turn a 1/1 into a 5/5. But yeah, Arcane Overflow is pretty much just better than Baited Arrow. And Baited Arrow did see a little bit of play, but I think it's definitely more of a Hunter card than it is a Mage card. But yeah, I mean, I think this card is fine. I don't really know where you play it, though. The only real Mage deck at the moment is Quest Mage, and I think this card is just too expensive for Quest Mage. I mean, Quest Mage is a 30 spell deck that doesn't play Apexis Blast, usually. So if you're not playing Apexis Blast, there's no shot you're playing Arcane Overflow. I mean, it is an Arcane spell, but I think this deck already plays like 10 Arcane spells, so it doesn't really need this effect. It is also a 5-cost spell, which has some synergy with, like, we saw the Parrot yesterday, but I can't imagine this card being worth playing with the Parrot. I don't know. Seems like a fine card that's probably not going to see any play. Maybe it's good in Arena, though. And finally for Mage, we have the Deepwater Evoker. 4-mana 3/4 Pirate. With Battlecry, draw a spell. Gain armor equal to its cost. So my first thought with this card is you can tutor a spell from your deck, which could be pretty powerful. But Mage actually already has both Starscryer, which Death Rattle draw a spell, and Frostweave Dungeoneer, Battlecry draw a spell. So if you're interested in just playing like a Wildfire deck and drawing Wildfire as consistently as possible, I think you don't really need this card. You just have 2 cheaper versions of this card. So I think to care about the Evoker, you do need to care about the part of the effect that gains armor equal to the cost of the card. And I'd say that starts being relevant somewhere around 4 mana. Maybe you're hitting like Fire Sale, and that's pretty decent. It's like a playably cheap card, but still expensive enough that you care about the armor. 4-mana 3/4 draw a card, gain 4 armor. Those seem fairly solid. Maybe Ring Toss would also be fine. Fireball probably doesn't really fit in the same deck as something that cares about armor. Obviously not playing this with Apexis Blast. Probably pretty decent with Springwater, but do you want to play minions in your Springwater deck? Probably not. So I think we're mostly looking at the really big Mage spells. But we talked about this a bit with Parrot, like Flame Strike isn't really a playable card at the moment, Deep Freeze isn't really playable either. But one of the things I liked with the Parrot was Mask of Cthulhu, just play like consecutive masks and eventually your opponent will die. The Deepwater Evoker is pretty good with Mask of Cthulhu. Gain 7, that gives you some breathing room to play the Mask, and then you play the Parrot, and then you play another Parrot. That could reasonably be a thing. But now that I've seen all the Mage cards, I just don't really see that being a deck archetype. Even if the power level of the meta is lowered a bit, I just can't see something like that making the cut. And similarly, this is pretty good with Grand Finale. There is kind of a playable Grand Finale deck already, but I think in that deck, you probably would rather just be playing Starscryer and Dungeoneer. Especially since you're playing the 2 copies of Grand Finale, but you're probably also playing the 2 copies of Hot Streak, so this card is going to gain 0 armor sometimes. But maybe you just care about hitting the Grand Finale really, really consistently, and the Deepwater Evokers may be fine for that deck. Overall, I'm not really too excited about any of the Mage cards in this set, to be honest. I'm really surprised they didn't get some big, like, puzzle box of Yogg-Saron or something. Especially since Clumsy Courier is in the base United and Stormwind set. Moving on to Paladin, we have Righteous Defense. 3 mana holy spell, set a minion's attack and health to 1. Give the stats it lost to a minion in your hand. So, first impression of this card is it's a very solid removal spell if you're up against big minions. If, I believe the card is called Proving Grounds, if that card goes off and there are big demons running around, then Righteous Defense is a pretty good answer to your opponent's Ancient Void Hound. And because this is a Paladin card, you give the stats to a minion in your hand. Paladin can really easily abuse this effect with like a Divine Shield, so you get even more value out of the stats. With a Catacomb Guard, you get way more value out of the stats. Anything with Rush, particularly if it also has Divine Shield, really good with this as well. So yeah, Paladin can abuse this effect pretty nicely. The problem is that on its own, it doesn't really do anything. It is a reactive card. Oh my god, you can use the scroll wheel to turn pages in the collection? Wow. Anyway. But if you're just playing like some sort of aggressive tempo Paladin, I think you want to just be playing like Goody Two Shields on turn 3 or North Watch Commander or something. You don't really want to be playing a reactive spell. So I don't think this deck really has room for that sort of card. And I don't think like a Libram Paladin would really care too much about this card either. And even if I'm wrong about that, if one of these decks is interested in playing a Righteous Defense, it still has to be right for the meta. And with the current meta, which to be honest I don't really see changing that much, I just don't see there being a home for this card. But it certainly is a card with a high enough power level to see play someday. Next up we have Wealth Redistributor. 5 mana, 2/8 pirate with Taunt and Battlecry, swap the attack of the highest and lowest attack minions. So this card itself has 2 attack, which means very often it will be the lowest attack minion. So it's probably just going to swap the 2 on this card with whatever the highest attack minion in play is. So if your opponent has like, say they're playing Quest for Warrior and they have their 7/7 Rikara in play, then you play this, you remove 5 attack from the Rikara, and this is a 7/8 taunt. That is pretty damn strong. But it has kind of the same issue as the last card. Is Paladin interested in basically a removal effect? I don't really know if it is. I think this is more likely to see play in some sort of tempo Paladin deck than the previous card, since this at least does something on its own. But I still think that you want this to be hitting something from the opponent pretty often, even if not every time. So I feel like at the moment it probably won't see too much play, but definitely a powerful card to keep an eye on. There's also maybe some cute stuff you can do with this card. You can hand buff the Wealth Redistributor and then use it to swap its attack with like a recruit that you have in play and gain some sort of like charge damage. But Paladin just does that better with its other buff cards, things like Conviction, so I don't really think you can do anything too cute with this. I think it's a pretty straightforward big Aldor Peacekeeper, basically. And Aldor Peacekeeper hasn't seen play in a while, but to be fair, this is quite a bit bigger than Aldor Peacekeeper. Moving on to Priest, we have Copycat. 3 mana 3/4 Beast, Battlecry, add a copy of the next card your opponent plays to your hand. So, I mean, this is another in a long line of Priest cards that give you something from your opponent's deck. I think it's pretty solid. 3 mana 3/4, can't really complain too much about that. You get a card from your opponent's deck, which, in general, cards from your opponent's deck are a higher power level than just a random card. You are guaranteed to get the card, which is nice. Your opponent can play around it. They can give you like a coin, but coin is useful. Or they can give you like, I don't know, a philosophy or something, which definitely is a bummer. But I think if your opponent's giving you a useless card, generally, they're probably going to have to be specifically playing around the Copycat, which has some amount of value for the Priest player. I also think this is maybe a pretty good addition to Quest Priest, because if you play this on turn 3, there's a pretty good chance your opponent's next card costs 4 mana, and that's pretty good for your quest, so maybe that's just good. I think it's a fine card. I don't think you're really ever excited to play it. Pretty much just going to play it in Control Priest sometimes, and maybe it's good enough. Next up for Rogue, we have Parrrley. 1 mana, swap this card for a card in your opponent's deck. So you play this card, you basically add a card from your opponent's deck to your hand, and then you add Parrrley to your opponent's deck. That's my understanding, at least. So like as a value card, compare it to something like, actually we don't even have to go to Wild because Swashbuckler is in Standard now. Compare it to something like Swashbuckler, I mean you probably get a higher quality card because it's actually from the opponent's deck, but you don't get the 1/1. And Swashbuckler is actually pretty far from being playable at the moment. So not too excited for Parrrley in that sense. It is sort of like pseudo combo disruption, because you can steal a card from your opponent's deck before they can combo with it. But I think for the most part, Savory Deviate Delight does that better. And if you're concerned about disrupting combos, actually Garrote also does that really well because the opponent's just fucking dead. So yeah, I don't think this is really good as a value card. I don't really think it's good as disruption. Just seems like a bad card, pretty much. Maybe it's good because it's a 1 mana spell in a Lone Shark Auctioneer deck, but I haven't seen that deck in months. Moving on to Shaman, we have the Suckerhook. 4 mana 3/6 pirate. At the end of your turn, transform your weapon into one that costs 1 more. Well, Shaman does play weapons, and 4 mana 3/6 isn't that bad. But I think this card is still pretty bad, because if you look at any playable Shaman weapon, they're generally played for a reason, because they're pretty good cards. You certainly never want to be playing this with Doomhammer or Bogspine Knuckles, because you transform them into a Hammer of the Naru, which is just way worse than either of those weapons. If you're playing it with like Auction House Gavel, you hit once with the Gavel, and then it transforms into a 3 mana weapon. I mean, like, in theory, that's okay. Most of the 3 mana weapons are going to be better than a Gavel. Or if you start with a Whack-a-Knoll Hammer, most of the 4 mana weapons are going to be better than a Whack-a-Knoll Hammer. But it really just doesn't seem worth a card. I mean, if you want more weapons in your Shaman deck, you already play Cage Match Custodian, and you might just straight up already play like 4 weapons. So I don't think you're really hurting for more weapon charges. And this card is random. It, like, at best gives you +1 durability, basically. Even if it lives, it still takes so much time to get value out of it. I just can't imagine ever putting this card in my deck on purpose. On to Warlock, we have Hullbreaker. 4 mana 4/3 demon with Battlecry and Death Rattle. Draw a spell. Your hero takes damage equal to its cost. Well, my first impression is that I don't really think Warlock needs help drawing cards, because they have life tap. And also, they don't really have any super high impact spells that are playable. Like, obviously, Touch of the Nathrezim and Drain Soul are good cards, but like, are you playing a 4 mana 4/3 to draw those? Probably not. In fact, the class's best cards, best spells that you would want to target are card draw spells. And if you play like Hullbreaker into Backfire, that's a lot of damage, and you're probably not even going to have the hand space to play Backfire. But like, maybe that's something you can do in Zoo, just so you never really run out of cards. In Zoo, you can also hit like Hand of Gul'dan to make Nightshade Matron more consistent. And I guess you can also just play Demonic Assault in that deck. Those are like your 3 spells, a couple big card draws. And Demonic Assault, maybe that's like fine for Zoo. But then you're playing a 4-mana 4/3 in a Zoo deck, which seems pretty underwhelming. And outside of Zoo, there's just nothing really that's that exciting to draw into. This is a tutor for Deck of Chaos. Maybe, I've played Deck of Chaos in the past and it's just been like really shit. But maybe if you can draw it on turn 5 every game, maybe it's okay. But yeah, I just don't really see the Hullbreaker doing much of relevance. Onto Warrior, we have the Blacksmithing Hammer. 4 mana, 5/1 with tradable. After you trade this, gain +2 durability. So 4 mana 5/1 weapon is pretty shit, I would say. Especially for the Warrior class, which has a bunch of weapons. And even in the 4 mana slot, they have Outrider's Axe, they have Reaper's Scythe, they also have Sword Eater. So not really hurting for a 4 mana weapon. But this is tradable. Tradable is good on its own, and after you trade this, gain +2 durability, then suddenly this is a 4-cost 5/3 weapon. 5/3 is 15 damage. So that is a lot. I could, in some fantasy world, see this being like a finishing card for a control warrior deck. You just trade it like a couple of times, and you remove your opponent's stuff all game, and then you finally equip the Blacksmithing Hammer and you just hit them over like 7 turns, and eventually they die. But for the current meta, that is certainly way, way too slow. This is also coming into the game at the same time as Rustrot Viper, which is going to make it really difficult for that strategy to ever be dominant. And even if you care about that sort of strategy in Warrior, the like slow grindy thing, you could just play Raid the Docks instead, and this obviously has pretty poor synergy with the Juggernaut because it just gets replaced. Even if you aren't interested in Raid the Docks, you can just play Rattlegore instead, which does the same kind of late game grindy thing as Blacksmithing Hammer. So, I mean, I see what this card like is supposed to do, but I just don't really see it being successful. I mean, maybe I'm thinking about it in too slow of a manner. Maybe this is an aggro card or like a mid-range card, and you draw it and you trade it away to make a 5/3, and then you play Corsair Cache, and then you play this on turn 4. It's a 5/4 weapon, and you just smack your opponent in the face and kill them on what, turn 7 with this card. Like, maybe that is a thing. That's like one really strong thing about having tradable on a specific kind of card, in this case a weapon, is you can just play 1 copy of Blacksmithing Hammer, and you could even play like double Corsair Cache Raid the Docks if you really wanted. And then you just have it's just like a 1 card draw engine, sort of, because you can keep trading it back in. But I really just can't see this being the strongest thing Warrior can do. Although I will say, though, it does hit the breakpoint for Cutting class, which is pretty nice as well. Maybe I'm underestimating the aggro potential of this card, but for now I think I'm going to say it's probably not going to see much play. And then finally for this video we have Multicaster, a neutral 4 mana 3/4 pirate with Battlecry. Draw a card for each different spell school you've cast this game. So spell schools being Fire Spell, Frost Spell, things like that. I think there are like 7 spell schools, something like that. So in theory, 4 mana 3/4 draw 7 cards. That's pretty insane. But the problem with that is, if you actually go through all the classes and look at their spell schools, most classes are dominated by, like for Priest, they have basically Holy Spells and Shadow Spells. So in Priest, I think you could realistically draw 2 cards with this. So is that good enough? 4 mana 3/4 draw 2 cards? Yeah, maybe. And I think Priest in particular doesn't really draw cards that well, if I'm remembering correctly. So, yeah, I mean, I could see this seeing play in any class where it could reasonably draw 2 cards. And I think for the most part, most classes probably can draw 2 cards pretty easily. For Shaman, you have mostly nature spells, but then you have the odd, like, arcane spell. I'm sure it has fire spells as well. Although I guess for Shaman, you'd probably just have a better card draw option. And maybe that's going to end up being the issue with this card. I do feel like it's sort of capped around like 2, maybe 3 cards. And it seems like most classes can probably draw cards a little bit better than with Multicaster. And I haven't gone through every class to see reasonably how many different spell schools each of them can play. But it probably can show up somewhere. There's no current deck where I'm thinking, like, oh my god, I'm automatically putting in 2 copies of Multicaster. Like, Quest Mage would be the first candidate, but do you really want to be playing... Do you really need a 4-mana minion that draws cards in your Springwater Cram Session deck? Probably not. So, I don't know. Good card, has potential in, I think, all 10 classes. Probably makes the cut somewhere in some deck.